I haven't started the recording of the stream yet, just so you guys know. So Tim, go ahead and give me a heads up when you're ready, and I'll flip the switch. Not yet. I mean, sorry, I'm good to go. The stream is up. I just haven't flipped over yet to the to this call. So just let me know when you're ready. Right. Someone needs to turn their video. Thanks for making me not be alone with the video there, Nick. All right, so Tim, because I've made you the host, you need to hit the record button down there and record to the cloud. You're on that, okay? And then, okay, and I'm switching on the live stream now.
Okay, great. Good morning / evening, everybody, for CoreDev 65. A pretty packed agenda today. So like we talked about last time, this is the chopping block call for Istanbul. So hopefully we can get through all the EAPs that have been proposed and get to agreement at the very least on whether or not we want to include them in the Istanbul upgrade. James, you want to go ahead and kick off the conversation on this?
James, I don't think your mic is working.
You are correct. Okay, restarting. Just as we talked last week, we're going to use our last all core devs call. We're going to use this core devs call to go through the EIPs and look at which ones have reference clients and which ones don't. And in the case that they don't, if there is someone here on the call to defend why they should not need one or why they should be exempt from this cut, then this is the time to make that defense. And I'd like to keep this conversation pretty focused because we have a lot to get through. So the format is going to be, I say the status, and I read through all of the EIPs and looked at their their implementation inside the EIP. So if I'm out of date on any information, that is why. Then I'll say that if it has a reference or not, and then I'll ask if anyone, and if it doesn't, I'll ask if anyone here will fight to keep that EIP. And if there isn't anyone that steps up, then I'll move on to the next EIP.
Sounds good.
Yep. So I'll start from the top. And then after that, we'll go through the list that you have of ones to go in deeper conversation, but I want to keep this really moving along, so we'll do it quickly. So 1665 has a reference client. The subroutines and static jumps. 663, unlimited swap and dupe, doesn't have a reference client.
I have implementation of that.
Okay, you do? All right, so I'll add that one to having a representation. ProgPow 1057 has a reference client or reference implementation. 1108 replacing alt bin 128 has a reference client. And I'm just going down the list sequentially. 1109 does not have a reference client. That is precompiled opcode 1109. So if no one has a defense for that, then I will leave that one as not having one. 1283 S-Store net gas metering does have a reference client. 1344, the chain ID opcode has a reference client. 1352 restricted precompile range does not have a reference client.
I think the last one doesn't require any implementation changes at this stage. It's just a formalization of.
Okay, so then I can also mark that one as not needing that. The 1380 self-call gas costs does not have a reference client. Does anyone have a defense for that?
Can you repeat?
1380 self-call gas costs.
No, it's not mine, so I won't talk.
Okay, thanks, Luis. 1559, the fee market change. That one doesn't have a reference client, and it's not close enough. I can give an update on that later, but I won't do that as part of this discussion. 1702 account versioning has a reference client. 1706 S-store disable below gas left does have a reference client. 1707 use version byte prefix for contract account versioning does not have a reference implementation.
Sorry, what list are you reading off now?
I don't think that one is in the list, or is it?
I can post it in. I have two computers open, so I can read and talk at the same time.
Is it your Google Doc?
Yeah, it's the Google Sheet. If someone could link the Google Sheet in there. I'm just going down. I'm on row 17 right now for anyone following along at home. So use version byte prefix for contract account versioning.
No, that one should be dropped.
Okay. 1712 disallow deployment of unused opcodes. Does not have a reference implementation. Does anyone have a defense for that?
That one is, I mean, the issue, I think right now, that one is not in the 660, 79, the Istanbul matter hard fork. So I was just not sure whether we can get it, but I do have an intention that if we define a new version, then maybe if we define a new account versioning, then maybe it's a good idea to apply that. But anyways, it's not. I think it's not in the meta hard fork, so it shouldn't be discussed in this stage.
Is that yours, Wei?
Yeah. So it's a disallow.
But do you think
the disallow unused opcode? I think that will be really useful when we define a new version and just get away with those backward compatibility issues. But like the only issue right now is I think I forgot or something that is currently not in the meta EIP list. So I think
it isn't.
Out of discussion at this moment.
Okay. Well, it wasn't in the list because it hasn't been merged yet, but it was submitted in time, so that's why it was kept on the list.
Okay. So
and if it has a reference, then let's just say it has a reference, and then we can come back to that as another discussion, or it doesn't have one.
Okay, it doesn't have one right now, but if it really depends on whether we want, whether we can define a new version for Istanbul, and it's a relatively simple, really simple change, and I think in some cases it can be beneficial.
It would screw with all the metadata that it puts in at the end of the bytecode, right?
Yeah, it would screw all the metadata, but it would be a really really good thing to have, to make sure new versions don't have backward compatibility issues. But anyway, so I think I will drop this because
okay.
Yeah, there are issues.
All right. Well, thank you, Wei. 1803 opcode rename that has a reference client. 1845 the fork name standards that doesn't have a reference client.
So the fork name standards isn't the case. I mean, don't we only have to modify the test harnesses? It's not actually a hard forking change. Or am I wrong?
That's my understanding of it.
Okay, so then I'll list that as not needing one. 1884, the tree independent repricing has a reference client. 1891, contract-based account versioning does not have a reference client. That's 1891, contract-based account versioning.
I think that was
It's also
1702.
ways.
Yeah. 1702 is the preferred solution over that, if I recall.
Yeah, like all the other conversioning should be dropped.
Okay, then
Except if that's 1702.
I'll also note that one. Then on 1930, call with strict gas that does not have a reference client. Moving on to 1959, method to check if chain ID is part of the history of, then it cuts off the text because it's too long of a title. The 1959, that does not have a reference client. Does anyone have a defense for that? So then it doesn't need one?
Oh, it needs one.
Okay, so then it does not have one. 1962, generic ECC precompile. That has one. 1965, historic chain ID.
Does it really?
It had.
Yeah, it was posted this week for like preliminary pull request into parity for the Rust implementation. And we finished the C++ implementation today, which most likely will be integrated in Go Ethereum. I mean, it's up to preference of Go Ethereum developers whether we will either integrate Rust into the compiler pipeline to assemble, or just use the native Golang compilation of C++. But in principle, we will also integrate it into the gas early next week.
Okay.
Have this discussion later in the meeting.
Yeah. Let's have this discussion later. It has one at least in the EIP,
Yeah.
and it's listed.
James, just coming back to 1959 before, on the last call, Ronan advised that we could drop it. So that's part of the decisions made.
Okay, then I will put that. I will also note that too. 1965 historic chain ID. Did we just say that one? No, the historic chain ID 1965 doesn't have one. It has been reviewed on the all core devs call. It doesn't have a reference client. Is this one that doesn't need it?
It needs a reference client, in my opinion.
Is anyone willing to fight for it? Okay, moving on to 1985 list of EVM parameters. That one does not have a reference client.
I don't believe it requires one because it's like 99% of that is just on paper specification, which is being discussed, but also EVMC implements most of these parameters as they are
Okay.
specified.
So there's one complexity about that. For if we do it only in the EVM, then it's fine. We don't even need to hard fork for it. If we want to apply it to the block validation and apply the same limits for the uncle timestamp, then yes, we do need to hard fork at a certain block, and thus, yeah, should have a reference implementation. But it's fairly trivial. Though.
So that would it need one today?
Yeah, I don't. That's really.
Can you say that last part again? Or it should it or it shouldn't for today?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I don't know where that leaves us, if it needs a reference implementation or not. And if we want to go the full limited only within the EVM or within the full block envelope.
Okay, well, I'll leave that one as TBD depending on those kind of things. And then obviously the more likely that it is the not fork version, the likely it'll happen. to 2014 extended state Oracle. Alex, I believe that's yours. I do not see a reference implementation on that.
So I was looking for the mute button.
Yeah. I was going to say if you're talking, you're muted.
Yeah, I think, well, nothing happened on that front, but it would be, I guess on one part, it would be a recommendation how to extend the state with data. And the first example for that was the chain ID. But since it really seems that a different alternative implementation for the chain ID is selected, then I guess this won't be needed right now.
Okay.
So I'm happy to drop it.
All right. Well, thank you. Blake, 2B 2024 has a reference implementation. 2025, the developer block reward has a reference implementation for the one that it depends on. And this is mine, so I would need someone else to make this call, not me. But I think that it is simple enough that it's okay to not need one. And maybe we can come back to that one at the end, Tim, when I hand it back off to you. 2026 is the fixed prepayment that does not have a reference client. That is Alexi's.
Yeah, it does not have a reference client. That's correct.
Okay. And I don't think I didn't see reference clients for the either 2027 or 2029.
Well, there was an implementation for 2027, but I wouldn't consider it a reference client because I said that there are complexities there. And so I would not consider it as a reference implementation yet.
Not yet.
No.
Then I don't think if you have something that has been enough for the other EIPs, and I think it wouldn't be fair to say that all of them need to be up to perfection or up to a complete status, just a implementation. So I would actually say that should still be the case for 2027 at least, if you say that's fair.
Okay, yes, we've implemented it, but it's not in the client which could produce the conformance test, which is my definition of reference implementation. Yes, we could see how it goes, but it might be that it would be dropped, so it's fine.
Okay, well I'll leave it in for now. In 2028, get call data gas reduction.
Yeah, it does have a reference implementation.
Oh yes, it does. I know I've seen that one, so I don't know. I must have missed marking that one. 2029 state counters, and we're almost done, guys. So
no reference implementation for 2029.
Okay, 2031 net transaction counter.
No, not for that one either.
2035 stateless contract storage.
Stateless contract storage. What was that? Is it also mine? 35.
It sounds like it's yours, but it may not be.
Stateless contract. Oh, yeah. So it's no. There's no reference implementation for that.
Okay, 2045 fractional gas cost. That does not have a reference implementation.
I think we have one, but I'm not sure if we've pushed it yet.
Okay, well that's good enough for me. 2046 reduced gas cost for precompile.
I would defend that it doesn't need a reference implementation because it's a one-line change. But there must be an agreement between this and the other version from Jordi.
Okay.
And doesn't it also need to be an agreement between this and what is considered precompiles?
Yes, that's correct.
Then that is all of them.
Thanks a lot, James, for this thorough review. I guess in terms of next steps, does it make sense to say that the ones that do not have a reference implementations and that didn't have a justification for that should be dropped for Istanbul. And it's not a question to you, it's a question to everyone.
Yes.
If we're going with a model of more frequent updates, I think it's fine because they can just hop on the next train.
Yeah, I think it's fine.
Yeah, that was the intent, I guess. Anyway.
Okay. Does anyone disagree with this? Okay. If not, so it seems like we have rough consensus that everything without a reference implementation, except the few exceptions we mentioned, which were 1352, 1845, 1985, 2027, and 2046, will be dropped for this upgrade. Anyone else have any comments on this? Okay. So moving on, so to the next section, this is a bit the opposite. So these are EAPs that have been discussed for considerations and that may or may not be ready to make it over the finish line and to be accepted for the upgrade. So now I'm back to the list on the agenda for the call. I'm going to go through them sequentially. If anyone has thoughts about them, comments, please speak up. I gathered this list by asking everyone who was on the previous call which EAPs they thought were most important to discuss. So there's no specific speaker assigned to any of them. So the first one on here is 615, which is in last call right now.
That's the one to add about 10 different opcodes on about 3 different themes, which is jumps, subroutines, and code data. There are no tests in this. And there was a little bit of pushback from the EIP author when asked to add tests. He wants to be grandfathered in under the old rules. I don't think it is prepared enough to go into a hard fork in about a month or a month and a half. I think there's good ideas in there, but I think it would be better served on a future hard fork.
I totally agree with that. And yeah, a couple of days ago, Christian Wright-Wiesner posted on a 615 fellowship thread, summarizing basically a lot of the things that I have voiced earlier as well. So I would be in favor of dropping it, as I've said before.
Does anyone disagree strongly with this and wants to fight for keeping it in the hard fork?
And okay. This isn't a final rejection. This is just a not Istanbul rejection. So.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we have consensus on not having 615 as part of Istanbul, but not fully dropping the EAP if in the future it has more tests like was mentioned. Next one on the list is EAP 1344, which is the chain ID opcode. And 1965, there was a lot of discussion about this on the Gitter in the past week. Namely, can we make a decision on 1344 independently of 1965? And the author for 1344, unfortunately, cannot be on this call. So does anyone have opinions there?
Can someone explain why we need a chain ID opcode rather than just using like a fixed address for returning the chain ID of the current blockchain, because it can be deployed deterministic?
How do you mean, Wei?
Like we can either use create2 or create with a fixed known address with a nonce, or create2 which is more deterministic, to just deploy a contract in different blockchains, which just return the current chain ID of this blockchain. Why doesn't that work? Like why do we need a new chain ID opcode?
If there's a
So
fork off of the deployed contract, then the chain ID might change from the deployed values. This is a fork protection.
yeah, I would also add another one. So in the Go Ethereum, we recently added canonical hash table oracles, and so there's a contract which can tell you what's the canonical hash of a block at a certain height. And we deployed that contract on Ropsten and Rinkeby and Mainnet. And the thing is, it's pretty nice to have the same set of signer keys for the testnets. So we submit signatures. I sign it, Peter and Felix and whoever, a signature saying, yeah, this is the canonical hash for block X. And when that is validated on chain, it's nice if that signature also contains the chain ID, so that no one can just take the signature and submit it, and that someone who validates it, the signature, can see that yes, this signed piece of data was intended for Rinkeby or Ropsten, without actually knowing the address where that contract is located, but just seeing that yes, I have 3 signatures and that's all I need.
Okay, so I do agree with that it has usage, but right now the only issue for me for 3044 is that its specification is not really clear at this moment. I think if we just I don't think it's possible to define the chain ID of a block, but it's possible to define the chain ID of a transaction. So if we change 3044's definition to make this chain ID opcode to return the chain ID of the transaction, then that's more okay with me.
How could you change a chain ID within a block?
So a block, yeah. But I mean, in practice, it's exactly the same thing. But yeah, I agree with what you're saying. Any code that is executed is always in the context of a transaction.
I mean, it is not always the same, because right now we can still send transactions with no chain ID that is not replay protected. So in that case, there will be practical difference for those two definitions.
Why do you prefer your variant then? Could you explain that?
I mean, the issue is there's not a really clear way to define what is blockchain ID, and also the issue is that it might change. So I do say that's a potential hazard for future like forward capability issues we might have.
So you're saying that if someone, so one possible drawback is that if someone forks off Ethereum, having this chain ID opcode will discourage them from actually changing the chain ID because they might break things.
Yeah, but I mean, it all depends on how this chain ID opcode is used. We do have a lot other opcodes that is dependent on the transaction. Like we can get the transactions gas phase or some other properties of the transaction. But like currently, like I think if we define chain ID also in that category, it will be a lot like clear rather than define it as a property of the blockchain, because the chain ID can indeed change in the future.
I think it would be the property of the current block. So it would just be which chain ID. So if transactions specify a chain ID, which is the chain ID at that block that's accepted. So if it's then a hard fork later, you'd see that change. Now, the only difference in practice becomes whether or not chain ID returns 0, null, some kind of sentinel value to say this transaction did not have a chain ID at all. because they're still accepted.
I mean, if we talk about like also change of chain ID, then the issue is it may not like like this certain block may have multiple chain IDs for backward compatibility issues. Like for a future hard fork, maybe there's a chain split and we want to apply a new like additional replay protection, then we need to define a new chain ID. But in that case, we might still want the old chain ID to continue to work because some contracts may depend on that already. So that's my argument. There may be multiple chain ID within a block, and I don't think it's an inherent property of the block. Rather, it's a property of a transaction.
Yeah, I would kind of agree. It would be good, yeah, at this point if Bryant, if he has any thoughts about this. I kind of agree with what you're saying, Wayne.
So given that there's still like this uncertainty, is this something we think can be resolved for Istanbul, or would this have to go to the next upgrade?
So regardless, this is a trivial one to implement, regardless if it's on the block or I mean on Genesis, or if it's on the transaction. But there may be security implications aside from the actual implementation difficulty, which is none.
Okay,
Hard
so
to
to
say.
ask, oh, go ahead, please.
I was wondering if Wei could post his concerns into the ETH Magicians thread on 1344 with his proposed solutions for that, so we could keep the conversation rolling there.
I mean, right now, if we can all agree that for for a transaction that is not signed with replay protection, it has like if in that transaction, if you call chain ID to return 0, then those two will be equivalent. But if that if for a dump replay protected transaction for the chain ID opcode, it still returns a value different than 0, then those two will be different.
Yeah, so I just reread the initial proposition for this change, and essentially the reason why it was proposed was that the smart contract wanted to ensure that a transaction which was given to it by like a raw signed transaction was actually replay protected for the current blockchain. So in this case, it does make sense that chain ID returns the ID of the current chain rather than the ID of the current transaction, because otherwise you can trick the smart contract into accepting something that it didn't really want to accept. Because at the moment the chain ID had to be hard coded in the smart contract to be equals to 1. So, but the idea was that it would be more generic.
But I think you can just check whether, like in the smart contract, you can check whether the chain ID returns 0, right?
You could, but it's basically like what you suggest is define the original purpose of this change.
I don't really. Maybe we can discuss this later. I didn't quite.
Yeah, just to be mindful of time. Given how small of a change this is, do we want to put it on hold for the next call, resolve those issues, and then potentially still include it, or do we want to push it to the next upgrade?
I mean, I would say that there was quite a lot of discussion about it already in the what is it, in the Gitter and in the Magicians, and I think kind of people. What I could gather that it was basically, now we're starting to go around in circles and trying to. So I would just basically implement it as we agreed in the chats.
What is the agreed version like?
The agreed version is basically just for the opcode to return the current chain ID of the blockchain. Because I understand that you might have some kind of sort of like aesthetical issues with it, but I think they're just purely aesthetical from my point of view.
Like I still don't I can't quite agree with that, because like in the last Gitter discussion on the China issue, I think the author kind of stated that the intention was to use the definition of China of the transaction. Yeah, and I still think that using the China of the blockchain will have a lot of potential backward compatibility issues in the future. So it's not future compatible, which I think is probably not a good idea.
But are those futures going to happen? Are we going to have blockchains? Are we going to have multiple chain IDs in the same block? That's not what it seems like a new concern that, I don't know.
Yeah, and just to be mindful of time, we're almost halfway through the call and we have a lot of EAPs to get through. So is it worth pushing back this discussion to ETH Magicians and following up on the next call? Unless we can get like a resolution in the next minute or so, I think it's probably more productive to go through all the other EIPs. No one seems to disagree vocally, so I think given how small of a change it is, let's just go back and figure this issue out and then potentially accept it in the next call if we have consensus. Another one that's related to this is 1965. So this was the precompile approach. Does anyone have thoughts on that one?
I don't think we should facilitate minority forks with the effort we put in mainnet. If they want to do that, they can put in the work and propose changes, but I'm not. I think it's more work than needed, and I think they both can go in. It's not an either or.
Yeah, I agree that we could drop it.
Does anyone disagree with dropping this? Okay, so let's agree it's dropped from Istanbul at the very least. Next one is 1283/1706. So for some context there, we wanted to move the conversation on this and try to organize an AMA on ETH Magicians. No one seemed to have concerns that they brought up there. And Hayden, hope that's how I pronounce their name, from Uniswap came in just to say they supported this. So I don't know if anyone has opinions about the 1283.
I think the only issue is still just the EIP number, but that shouldn't really affect our discussion right now. We can it's just a documentation issue, and we can accept or reject this EIP without considering that.
Isn't this the one we just had the Alcor Devs Gitter discussion about merging in context of another EIP?
Yeah, so it's the EIP 200. So that is like just to facilitate in the case if we have 8084 included, then we also need to change spec of 1283 a little bit. So in that case, it might be easier to just create a new EIP.
So this 1283 as it's currently proposed, does this also come automatically with that other EIP which prevents this mechanism from happening if you have less than or equal to 2,300 gas?
That is 1283 and 7006 combined. 200 does combine 1283 and 7006.
So does anyone disagree with accepting 2200 as a replacement for 1283 and 1706?
You're talking about just meta now, or are you talking about accepting or rejecting the EAP?
Accepting 2200 into Istanbul as a replacement for 1283 and 1706.
I want to make a note. It was discussed a few times that there should be a new EIP for 1283. And the reasoning against that, I think on the last call, was that a lot of the clients have 1283 implemented as is, which was enabled for Constantinople and then disabled for Petersburg. And these clients would want to keep this behavior and have the switch toggled again to enable it. And that was the reason for not renaming anything or having a new EIP.
But isn't 2200 resolving some conflicts between another proposed EIP? It's not a direct implementation.
It does have apparently it does have the full spec.
What was the question again? Is it about reference implementation?
No, what precipitated the need for 2200? Was it because it conflicted with another EIP that needed to have some clarity, or?
It is actually, so the issue is there's a 8084, which changed the gas price of S lot. And in that case, the 2080, no, the 1283 has a hard dependency on the old S lot gas cost. So it is hard coded there, and we can't change that. So so if we accept 8084, then we need to change the spec of 1283 a little bit. So in that case, we need a new EIP for that, and that will be 2200. And regarding the issue of reference implementation, at least party won't need that because our definition of 1283 is actually the same as 2200. So we just need to change the config parameter. At least that's the case for parity.
Can we clarify what 2200 is? To my understanding, this was discussed like 5 minutes before the call, and to my understanding is that 1884 changes the cost of S load, and 1283 isn't changing that, or yeah, I'm not sure about that part. But
okay, I can explain. So 2200 does not change anything regarding S load. It only changes the S store gas cost. It changes it changes two parts. First, it just changes two gas cost values of 1283. First, when the original value, when the current value equals new value, basically means the SS store is a no op. Then in that case, we always charge the same as slot, which previously was 200. And because we have 8084, it becomes 800, I remember. And another is related to the final one, which is when you set a value using an asset store and then you reset that value. the refund also contains a little bit of the gas cost of iSlot. So that gas cost is also changed from like it's a value minus the iSlot gas cost, which we need to just take account into the new iSlot gas cost. So there's no logic change, nothing else changed. It's just the part which it was related to iSlot gas cost changed. So it's basically still the same with 1283.
So it sounds like we're in agreement that we want the functionality of 1283 and 1706, and it's just a question of how we're documenting at this point. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, but so 2200 seems to me like the best summary of the entire thing.
Yeah, I like the clarity since it seems to be interacting with other things, other EIPs that we're likely to accept. The clarity of having the actual right gas costs, so you don't have to order EIPs within one hard fork would be nice.
So I don't think 1706 should be bundled with 2200/1283, just because, I mean, versioning is a huge change that would apply to many, potentially apply to many EIPs going forward.
1702 or 1706?
1706.
And Casey, just to be clear, are you objecting just on like the documentation / bundling, or do you have an issue with
just the bundling?
So just again, to be mindful of time, does it make sense to say we go forward with all the functionality described in 2200 for Istanbul, and we sort out the documentation / formatting outside of this call? Does anyone disagree with this?
And this also means we apply net gas metering without account versioning.
Yeah, 1706 used to be bundled with 1283. 1706 is the S-store, so that doesn't need to be bundled anymore. 1702, I think we also last call decided not to bundle it, to apply 1283 and 1706 across all versions.
So just to be clear, if you do net S-store metering, whether 2200 or 1283 without versioning, then aren't we in the same situation before Constantinople?
No.
So the 1706 is the fix.
Yeah, it would require 1706.
Okay.
So 1706 is basically the sentence: if gas left is less than or equal to 2300, fail the current call frame without a gas exception.
I see.
Okay. So does it make sense to move forward with 2200 in functionality and then sort out the naming and whatnot async? Does anyone disagree with this?
So can we clarify that we want to bundle with 1706, the fix for S-store, or we don't?
Yes,
we bundle it with 1706, and 2200 contains it contains the cost in 1706.
Yeah, so that's what Tim meant with the functionality of 2200.
Yeah, we do everything in 2200 and we determine whether we call it 1283 plus 1706 or 2200 async. Does that make sense?
So I don't object to it, but I'm not a fan either. Just want to say that.
To the functionality or the documentation?
Oh no, the whole thing. I mean
Okay.
the entire.
Okay.
I proposed like different approach to 1706, and now it's bundled with something else, and that's not going to be reviewed, or
What was your strategy or idea?
it was to just disallow any state modification when you enter a call with low gas up front.
Would that include log operations?
No, logs will be allowed because that was, I think, the original idea of stipend anyway. So it's described.
Yeah, I think that's an elegant approach.
It's described at this link that actually the where discussion was supposed to be. So I think it's not time to go into detail there, but I would like to get feedback on it.
Does the
I
static
think
call?
I just think that may be equivalent because the only state modification. So you mean including access store and also call and create tool, etc. Is that the case?
Yeah. Originally, I wanted to like enter static mode, but then realized actually the logs must be allowed, so it's a kind of like semi-static mode. So for simplicity, I would suggest to disallow anything except for logs. So static mode with logs allowed. But it was mostly for simplicity. Maybe there are some cases where that would be useful. You still can do a call provided you don't send any ether with it. So
Was this specified in an EIP anywhere?
no, it's not. It's specified in the discussion where discussion about the IP is going on.
I just think it might actually be more complicated, just because we're introducing, like, we can't use the static mode of the current EVM or anything. We need to define a new mode of the EVM, which is arguably a little bit more complicated than just simply disallow access store when you have low gas cost. But I mean, I'm not really strong on that.
So I put some reasons why I think it's better from my perspective, but I think let's read it first and maybe you can discuss offline.
Yeah.
Okay, so are we not making a decision on 1283, 1706, and by extension 2200?
Can we agree that it's tentatively agreed and this proposal by Pavel will be reviewed?
Okay.
By the next call, does that sound like
that
an
would be
option?
good.
Okay.
decision.
So this overall functionality will be part of Istanbul. We'll review Pavel's proposal and also at the same time how we bundle it all. But there's general agreement on the functionality. Does that make sense? Okay. Next one on the list is 1962. Does anyone have opinions on that one?
Sorry, which one is that?
It's for EC precompile, which we kind of started the discussion, which was not the time. So since the last developers call, so there was a kind of requirement that it's much easier to integrate SC implementation into the existing gas client, at least. So right now there is SC implementation, which will be integrated, and or as an alternative option, we can also just integrate building the Rust implementation along with building the Go Ethereum itself. So it's actually up to developers for which option is better for them. But right now there are two implementations which are quite independent. And what we do now is we basically fuzzy test them one versus another. So if either one of those crashes, for example, or just if they give different results. So this is what I'm going to do for next 2 weeks at least, with just more computing power, and simultaneously finish the gas metering.
So in my opinion, since it's fairly complex cryptography, I would have liked to seen both of these libraries finished. Sorry about the noise. Finished and publicly, out there for a couple of months and fussed by different people for weeks and months.
Oh yeah, I mean, from the perspective of having them available, those are available and largely finished. So if I find something by fuzzing, I will just fix it much faster for discrepancy of the results, especially. But those are public anyway already.
I think what Martin's trying to say is he'd feel better if this wasn't in Istanbul, but was in the next hard fork. It's a big change and it needs more review time.
Yes, that's what I'm trying to say.
So the kind of the part of the strategy which was also discussed for this precompile is it's well, basically the universality, the global universality is the only difficult task to implement it. Everything else is trivial, and you can just take a lot of existing implementations and just test them more, and most likely those are already tested. So also a separate strategy was discussed for, again, if we use the same code base in principle and continue to review it and improve the quality, but for next hard fork, we just give a set of, I think it was 6 to 8 curves, which are most likely will be the most interesting for developers for next year or half a year. And in the next hard fork after it, it will be allowed to use generic functionality.
But this is already the most complex precompile I've seen specified. And there's 4 direct branches based off the first parameter with different gas metering rules. It's deceptive to call it one precompile. It's at least 4 different things. And then you're adding on more possible curves in the future. I'm not comfortable getting it in this one right now.
Yeah, and I would like to add, I mean, we've had the previous times we added advanced, or at least to the layman, advanced crypto as precompiles. There have been headaches and a lot of difficulties and we had consensus issues on precompiles, which was not trivial to fix and not trivial to find, and trying to fix it is very devious because when you submit a patch to a library in crypto, it's pretty obvious that you're patching a vulnerability which can be exploited in a second. So I'm very wary of these, and I'd like to have the 2 or 3 implementations differentially fast. I mean, I assume they won't crash, but differentially fast for a long time. That's my take. It's too soon for Constantinople. It's my opinion.
Well, the differential testing is actually what is we are doing right now, and just from the implementation perspective, it's actually one precompile, because as soon as you implement one curve, you get all other for free. It's not that difficult.
But there's 4 different operations: add, multiply, exponentiate, and pairing check. And pairing check is a completely different syntax on all the parameters that come after that parameter.
Well, I mean, the binary interface, it just depends what you define as a totally different. The binary interface is different, but those are for developers. And most likely those will be just hard-coded. The first part will be hard-coded. by developers, well, in a smart contract. Uh, just from in terms of arithmetics, it's actually not that different altogether. But this is not the part of the main discussion. That's why what I think is kind of optimal is to, even while we still will test for kind of complete uh, any discrepancy in completely kind of universal and generic mode of using the existing code base, as it just we don't need to allow users to kind of poke the contract with all the available parameters, which in principle would give the universality. But we can just limit those parameters to the list, which will correspond to instantiations of this, well, 6 to 8 curves. And the list of those is public, well known, and like for people who would want to use it, those are the most interesting ones. And it will kind of exponentially reduce the scope of the precompile for next fork. And then if we're satisfied with the quality of the testing, and maybe we'll get at some point one more alternative implementation in some other language maybe, then it can be kind of in this case this restriction can be lifted, and then users will have in principle the same code base with the same rules for gas metering, which is still quite universal but not too complex. But then there will be kind of much smaller chance that there is some potential problem which wasn't seen. To implement something just for a set of specific curves, especially if there are already implementation for in two separate languages, which are not kind of direct relatives from one another, it's actually not this difficult.
I wanted to suggest something that, I want to suggest the kind of for now, the optimistic approach, because so to me, it looks like this is really a very attractive change. And also I can see that the guys that are working on it are really, seems to be really productive and actually doing lots of stuff in a very short time. So I think we should just wait and see what happens and what they can show us instead of being super defensive about it.
I would also second that in context of looking at all the EIPs, there's a handful that are the furthest along as far as testing and clients and being reviewed, and this is one of those.
So, oh, Daniel, you have your hand up, so please go ahead.
One of the questions I asked on ETH Magicians wasn't answered was why, the parameterizing the curves I get is fine as parameterizing, but we're parameterizing the 4 distinct separate operations. Those should really be 4 distinct but interrelated precompiled contracts. And as a developer, I would have a nightmare trying to have to cram all of my parameters into this binary string. And I would like to hear what the Solidity and Viper team thinks about the usability of this interface. So beyond the cryptography, I think there's issues. The cryptography sounds great and everything, but as usability, I have concerns as a developer using the API.
Just sorry to jump in here, just to be mindful of time again, and based on what Alexei and James have previously said, does it make sense to deal with those questions offline and come back to this EAP on the next call, similarly to 1344?
Yes, I asked my question 11 days ago, and if we can actually keep the discussion on ETH Magicians, I'm happy to.
Okay, well, I just not that spending there too much time on there. Sorry. The only question I would like to clarify from the core developers is like, what is the kind of suggested time for fuzzy testing in terms of like CPU days in a multi-core system, or like what was the previous experience for this purpose?
That's hard to say. I don't unfortunately have a good answer to give, but generally, weeks and months. I can't really specify it. Sorry.
So the question is from the perspective that if we increase the parallelism of the fuzzy testing, we can run it on multiple very powerful machines. Then we can just have like years in very short time. So the question is like, if we can define some criteria by them, like in the next call or during if magicians, then we will just know what the acceptance criteria are. And I mean, if we don't have them, then we sort of will never be able to say that they're tested enough. But if we have them, then we'll have some clear indicator. So okay, we passed some mark. And now we can be safe about the results of the testing.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't give any such figure. But if you, for example, if all the code is published and the steps for doing the testing, how to set up the type of fuzzing you're doing and how the integration is done, so that anyone else can take it for a spin and see, do you actually hit the right things, or could we modify the fuzzing settings to make sure that we get more coverage and smarter inputs and stuff like that? I think it would help a lot. Yeah, I can't give any hard metrics.
Yeah, okay, I will write a manual about this, how to spin your own instance.
Great.
And
sorry to keep. Oh, go ahead. Please.
Yeah, I think to add it's connecting the Solidity team or the Viper team to have feedback on the UI is a good action item for the cat herders.
Cool. So yeah, we'll look into that and follow up on that offline.
Just a quick question: Why is there an opinion needed from the Viper or Solidity team? Is it expected to have like language level support for this?
Because of the way that it's specified with the parameters, where your first code is a direct switch, would they just require the end users to create their own binary blob and cram it in? As a developer, I feel that's a bad experience and should be improved.
I think we can.
Sorry,
we could just provide a library for this. This is fairly straightforward. So we can make a very convenient library which just passes parameters in the right form.
Yeah, I would believe it has to be some kind of a library, and it doesn't need language support. If the question is about the overhead of crafting the message, then it doesn't really matter if that single first byte is there, because the rest of the encoding might have an overhead anyway in EVM.
But my concern is reading it. If you have to have a library to use a precompiled call, that makes me think that the precompile is too complex at the interface level, and it should be 4 different calls, one for each principal operation. And we can parameterize, and it's easier to read when we see we're doing an add, multiply, exponentiation. It's something I would expect in the name of the function, not in the value of the first parameter of the function.
Well, it was kind of the design decision not to make 6 new opcodes. Not opcodes, but different addresses, for which in principle under the hood would use the same code base.
We've already done that for the ECMOL AltBN 128. I think we should move this discussion to ETH Magicians because it's not going to get solved on this call.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And yeah, let's have this be part of the discussion on the next call, based on everything we just discussed. Moving on, ETH 2028 was also mentioned. So this is transaction data gas cost reduction.
Yeah, just here to present. So about 2028, we released 2 reference implementations that are available on GitHub, and I think are already pushed on available somewhere. I don't know exactly. I forgot. Sorry. It's very late where I am, so I'm sorry. Please apologize for the bit of confusion. And today we release also the analysis justifying the new price. So we found a price for which we are comfortable with, which is 16 gas per byte, and we want the community, the core dev, to react on it and have if they have any opinion, and so we can make into Istanbul.
When you say per byte, you mean per non-zero byte, right?
Per non-zero byte. 0 byte won't be changed for a simple reason that there would be implication for other existing smart contracts that we don't want to change.
Yeah, so I think the data that you released looks very good and well founded. I have no real objections.
You have no objections to include this in Istanbul? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I'd be glad to hear other opinions.
Does anyone object with included 2028? Okay. Do we have consensus for 2028 as part of Istanbul?
Let's do it.
Amazing.
There were some comments to decrease the cost even further. Is there any chance that the numbers could direct into that direction?
So the reason why we came with 16 is because we wanted to, since there was a short time before Istanbul, we came up with very conservative numbers, and there was discussion about EIP 1559, which would we want to use further reduction of identity for the new EIP. We don't have any objection. We just want to be sure that what our take on the matter would be, go with this reduction for this art fork and maybe push it further on the next one.
So I would, from a conservative perspective, I think would be better to just lower it by 2x instead of 4x. But now that I've seen the data that you made, I can agree that, yeah, maybe 4x is reasonable. I would not go lower than that. I think that would
Agreed.
be rash.
Completely agreed, for the same reason. That's exactly the same reason we came up to that number.
And sorry, I haven't looked at the data. 4x are the numbers that are currently in 2028, correct?
So, yeah, 4x is currently the number. The reason is we managed to make, so the technique we used was, security. So the main impact on 2028 would be security if we dismiss history, which we explain why. Security would be measured by anchor rate, as everyone agrees on the call. And what we did is 2028 is about network propagation. And what we did was creating packets that were at the exact same ratio than current packet on Ethereum, current block on Ethereum, but filling with it as many 0 bytes as we could. And we came up with blocks that were 20 times bigger than the average block size in Ethereum, which would not even create any uncles. So of course there is variance because it's network things, but for the data release can being pretty conservative, show that the 4x is very reasonable based on the data we provided.
Great.
So did I understand correctly that you did this actually on mainnet?
Yes, this is mainnet. You can actually look. Yeah. There is all the links. There is the address we used. There is the day we used, and for the fun fact, we made the biggest day in the history of Ethereum.
But did you say that you used 0 bytes for this procedure?
No. So what we did, I'm going to explain the processes to create the packet. So what we did is generate. So for a compression algorithm, the worst case scenario is a random byte. Everyone agrees on this, right? Random byte, no pattern, no one can compress. So what we did was creating a random string of bytes, replace all the zeros in that random string with other random bytes from 0 to 255. And then what we did is randomly choose an index, add a 0, and add 16 zeros at the append 16 zero at the end of the string, and shuffle the whole thing. So by doing so, we have data that are compressed by Snappy by only by 50% roughly, which is more or less a ratio that blocks on mainnet are currently facing.
Can I ask a clarifying question here? The EIP, so it does not specify an explicit maximum block size?
It does no. So since blocks are blocks are defined by block limit. What we say is that we should reduce the size of the cost of core data, and that's we just reduce that. We trying once again. We are being conservative for a very simple reason that this IP is needed by every layer 2, and we are looking for the most conservative numbers we could find, and from our data, the -4, like the diminution by 4, is pretty conservative based on our experiment.
Right, but reducing the cost of the call data by 4x. The thing is, when on the mainnet experiment, using a lot of 0 bytes, because it keeps referring in this, this post on ETH Magicians to the uncompressed size.
Yeah.
But if it goes live and people are using non-0 bytes, and you get compressed sizes, which are much larger than we're seeing in the experiment.
That's not how compression algorithm works. Compression algorithm look for patterns. They don't really care about the exact bytes. So I could actually show you, the snappy compression for our strings, and they are exactly the same ratio. You can actually take them, the blocks, the data is happened so there is an address in the post. You can look at any transaction. There is the extra data field is filled with our blocks, and you can try to compress it and put it other like blocks, and you see it would be the same ratio.
Okay.
So once again, the pricing of 0 doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, and that was already discussed last time on the core dev call. We don't want to change it for compatibility and for existing contract. We actually use that fact to do no analysis. So this is completely just like, yeah. See, this is completely like independence, and if you look at the data itself, we managed to make like windows which are 7.5 times bigger than the average size on Ethereum. So that's why we took the 4, because it's basically half of it, and it is pretty conservative.
Sure. Yeah, I guess just to explain, doing an even more aggressive cost reduction it's only been proposed, in the context of also having an explicit maximum block size, which would be conservative. But yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm in, strongly support.
Of
this.
course,
yeah.
But as Martin suggested, before seeing the data, it was for a -2 diminution. The data prove a -4 being conservative. I think we should all go for it and go further if needed in the next hard fork.
Great. Does anyone disagree with that? Okay, so 2028 accepted for Istanbul. Other one on the list was 2024. This is, Blake to be. So I think this was an issue around the gas cost.
So the gas cost isn't specified right now, and there's also discussions on ETH Magicians about the endian ordering of the bytes in it, and I haven't seen much resolution on there. I don't know if there's anyone on the call that's championing that particular one.
Okay, so let's have that conversation async in that case. Go ahead, please.
Sir, was that about the gas cost for the Blake to be?
There's no specification on what the gas cost should be in the EIP.
So yeah, it landed on 1 per round.
Is
as
that
far
in the
as I know.
discussion forum, or did it finally make it into the EAP?
I don't know if it's finally made it into the EAP. I thought it had. I'm not the author, but I've been taking part of the discussions, and there's
Okay.
been various benchmarks by them and by me, and yeah, one around seemed reasonable.
And did we get a resolution on the Indianness?
Not that I'm aware of.
That's a bigger consensus concern actually than gas.
There was quite a bit
Okay.
of discussion on it, but I don't think it's worth trying to make a decision on it without them being here.
Well, I think we can make it this. We can decide on the EAP per se. The NDNS is just we know the authors have noted that yes, there need to be test cases for both kinds of NDNS, so that will be resolved. It's an implementation detail.
Okay. So other EAPs that people brought up were just state rent in general. So to get a feel for, are there any specific ones that will potentially be included in Istanbul?
So there was only one which basically was kind of implemented out of 5 that I've written on May. Only one has been implemented. So as I said the last time, I'm not really kind of pushing very hard for them to be included, given the amount of things that are already in. So, but we'll see how, basically at the moment, I don't have a lot to show to just some one implementation. So I don't know.
Do we need to carve out space for you in the next hard fork explicitly reserved for state rent stuff?
Not sure. I think I want to first finish the fourth version of the state rent proposal, which is basically depend on how the data from the stateless client is going to go, because this is what drives more changes in it. Yes. I don't think we need to choose to reserve something yet, but so potentially it will go to the next one. And we don't know when the next one is going to be either. So.
Yeah, that sounds like a good topic for the next call. Okay, and so aside from state rent, the next big one was ProgPow. Hudson being away, I pinged him and Charles, who's also been working on the audit, and they wanted to discuss the idea of including ProgPow in Istanbul with the condition that if something negative comes out of the audit, we pull it out. So they were both curious about people's thoughts on that.
Haven't we already decided on exactly that?
Yeah, it seems like this conversations seems to be rehashed over and over. So to make a final call on this.
So a few all core devs calls ago, I expressed concern about a chain halting attack that could be done with 1/3 in power. I posted something on ETH Magicians on the discussion thread, and I haven't heard back from anyone on that. That's one of the things that I put into have the auditors look at, and that's something I'm actually concerned about if we implement it as is without changes. There's some mitigations we can do, but that's why I was hoping we would get the audit back before we fully commit to it to see if we need to do any of these mitigations. And I'm very skeptical it's going to come back from the audit with 0 mitigations.
Either way, don't we wait till the audit?
So if we wait till the audit to implement, this very likely means that it won't be ready for Istanbul.
We would have needed audit results today.
Your...
Sorry, Martin, I was talking over you. Go ahead.
No, I was asking you to link to your comment.
So does anyone feel like we should go ahead and implement ProgPow tentatively and then pull it out at the last minute if there's an issue that's revealed in the audit? Otherwise, we can have ProgPow for the next hard fork, obviously still assuming the audit comes back positive.
Is the last moment before we do a testnet fork or before we do a mainnet fork?
Yeah, I think it would be. I mean, if we go ahead with ProgPow, which I do think we should, I do think also it would be prudent to have ability to disable it very late.
And for context, sorry, just quickly for context, the date that was set for the test network upgrades is August 14. So this is a bit less than a month from now.
So I do think ProgPow should go in. I am skeptical that it would be responsible to do it in Istanbul without the audit findings. And if we let it fork into the testnet, we permanently got it coded in. So if we were going to pull it up last minute, it would need to be testnet, and then I'm concerned to put flags to fork or not fork. I think we're adding unnecessary complexity. Plus, I still would like to get feedback on my concern about the mitigation for the chain halting attack. I would even support an out-of-cycle fork for ProgPow, for the record.
So just because we're coming up on an hour and a half, do we have a consensus on what to do with ProgPow? It seems that Martin, you're thinking we should go ahead and implement it, and Dano.
Actually, I do agree. I've been trying to push that earlier, that we do an out of cycle release for ProgPow. So if other people are also on board with that, yes, I think that would be a good choice.
So meaning we wait for the audit, based on that, assuming it's positive, we then schedule a hard fork for ProgPow, correct?
Basically that, yes. And I think it would make a lot of other people happy to have a single purpose hard fork as well on ProgPow because it's so contentious.
Yeah, I guess that's the other question about this. Does it risk splitting the network? Is it contentious enough? And is that something we have time to discuss right now?
And also, I would say that this problem of the pre-committing to the testnet is also very troublesome. As Dana mentioned, we got into this trap with Constantinople, where once something is done in Ropsten, it has to be included in the mainnet, basically.
Yeah, but I mean, that pain will go away at some point. We're going to sunset Ropsten, right?
Yeah, at some point we have to apply it to Ropsten, but let's be really confident that we're good to go on mainnet, not a conditional kind of thing.
So reading the chat here, Trent is saying it makes sense to leave ProgPow out for this fork based on potentially having a future fork specifically for ProgPow. Is this something we have consensus on? Does anyone feel strongly we should push for ProgPow for Istanbul?
I feel strongly we push it out of Istanbul, but not over, I'm not over my dead body if other people want to push for it, but my preference is out of Istanbul.
Does anyone disagree with that?
Out of Istanbul and at a hard fork just as soon as the audit's ready.
Okay, so out of Istanbul and on a hard fork as soon as the audit's ready. I think we'll probably need a further discussion about whether or not this is a special single E or hard fork or not. So we're at an hour and a half. We've made it basically through point 1 on the agenda. To be mindful of people's time, is there anything else, especially related to Istanbul, that someone wants to discuss that they feel is very important we talk about now? Otherwise, I don't think we have time to address any of the other items on the agenda in any reasonable way, unless people want to stay on longer.
I motion we do some out of cycle all core devs calls as well leading up to the test network.
Would anyone oppose having the next core devs call next week rather than 2 weeks from now, if that's the case?
We would need to haggle over time.
We keep the same schedule. So whatever the next rotation should be, we do that.
Just a question. What is the call center around? Like, so right now it's 2:30 where I am. Where it's going to be next week?
It would be the original time, which would be 4 in the afternoon Berlin time, I think.
Okay, cool.
Well, it's going to be 2 p.m. UTC, I think.
Yeah, that's it. 2 p.m. UTC. So this, okay. So do we have consensus to have a next call next week instead of, like, not instead, probably as along with 2 weeks from now, and we can review the agenda, but probably mostly pick up where we left off this one.
Agreed.
Great.
What are the discussion topics next week?
So, so what we had on the agenda today is some concerns around EAP refactorings. So given that there's some dependencies between some of the EAPs for Istanbul, trying to sort that out. Conformance testing. So I assume this is around retest death and stuff like that. And then next week we would also have follow-ups on 1344, which we talked about 2200, and then potentially 1962 as well as any other EAPs that needs to be discussed for Istanbul. And then potentially, if we still have time, talking about what something like a special fork for ProgPow would look like.
Sorry, go ahead.
For 1344, I came on the call to talk about it. It seems like we're closing up the meeting here. I don't know what was discussed though today.
So there was some concern about whether the chain ID should be in the transaction or in the block. I think that was the biggest contention point. And we agreed to take that conversation offline to still keep this as a consideration for Istanbul, given how simple of a change it is. Yeah, but to just sort this issue out async.
Okay. And if that issue is sorted, then acceptance?
I guess, yeah, let's have that conversation on the next call, but it seemed to be the big issue, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Just a quick one. The security considerations ERP thing would be just like a very short one, but we can also do this on the next one if you want.
Very short, do you mean 1 minute or 15 minutes?
I would say like 2 minutes. It's just about adding a mandatory security considerations section to the ERP and requiring this to be filled out. It is intentionally being very relaxed so that we can start bringing more security into the process, and that's what it is meant to be. And it will at some point be followed up by a guideline. And we're currently gathering some information about that. So there will also be someone of us at an IATF meetup in Montreal, I think, in a few days. To also get some info from the ITF people there on maybe how to get more security into such a similar process. Just something to mention, PEP and RFC already have this section, and it's we are following the same thing that they are doing right now.
Yeah, ship it.
Yeah, I think I read through this. My only comment would be we probably don't want this to be a consideration for any of the current EAPs for Istanbul, right? We don't want to sort of add this extra step in stuff that's already moved along. But
yeah, that's the idea.
Yeah, great. Anyone else have comments on this? Okay, great. So we'll see you all next Friday at 14 UTC. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks all.